Wow, that was incredible. Thanks to all three of you for so many things that'll keep us thinking, I'm sure, for a very long time. We've got a couple questions that come in from the audience. So to Professor Hamilton and Pettit, you both talked about stopping mass incarceration for low-level misdemeanors in nonviolent offenders. I'd like to put that proposal in conversation with Professor Ritchie's comments that society only tends to rally around individuals deemed worthy. Don't policy suggestions that prioritize freedom for nonviolent incarcerated offenders put those deemed worthy above those deemed unworthy? And you have microphones in front of you, so I'll ask either one of you to start out.
Professor Ritchie pointed out some movements where people are literally trying to defund police departments, but really revert those resources to other things that could be more productive or perhaps better spent at developing populations. And I think that's important. I think they should be pursued. However, I also think that every community needs some tolerable security, that they're within any population, there's some deviance, and that I haven't gone to the point that we should not have security in place to address that deviance. In fact, it becomes predatory if you don't have securities in place to address deviance. So, I guess I would say that I think that a balanced approach to addressing both divestment of resources and police towards other activities that would be more productive in the first place, as well as having some tolerable security, would be necessary, including if somebody is engaged in violent crimes, then they should perhaps be removed from society.
Thanks. There are a couple points that I want to make. One is I think it's really important for us, especially in the context of the discussion of mass incarceration, to understand that the crime rate in the United States is at historic lows. It's at lows that we haven't seen since the late 1960s. So there clearly are, however, pockets of unconscionably high crime and violence. And so I think there is a sort of a public safety argument, certainly for some continued. I'm not. I've sort of become maybe not entirely an abolitionist, but what I just want to say in the state of Texas, right? We talk a lot, or people talk a lot about it's a model reform state and it's moving toward decarceration and there are fewer people incarcerated, but the proliferation of exposure through very low level, even traffic offenses, is profound. So over 5 million people in the state of Texas are brought into the system through something as minor as a speeding ticket, driving without a license, or something like that. And I think one of the reasons I talk about that and focus on that is because that's often what brings people in for the first time. And then they get, as people like Isa Kohler-Hausman and Alexandra Napitoff have talked about, they get entrapped in the system because of procedural hassles, because of repeated court appearances, and those become, that makes it prohibitive to maintain routines of work. I can't tell you, I've only been in the courtroom for about a year, and I can't tell you how many people get kicked out because their child is crying. They have to come to court to resolve a traffic ticket, they have to bring their child, the child cries, and they get kicked out. And one other, just an example. So I think we have to start somewhere, and I think that it's really important to start here because it brings people in ways that I think are easily avoidable. One other thing I just want to point out, I don't know how many of you currently have a cell phone on. So in courtrooms all over the state of Texas, you could get a deferral just for having it on. Not for using it, just for having it on. So there are, so we do police different segments of the population so differently, where the courtroom has a sign that says no cell phone use, and if you have your cell phone on, you can get a deferral and have to come back another day and take another day off work and find childcare another day. So I think that it's important that we have a conversation. In comparative perspective, the US incarcerates so many more as such a higher fraction than any other advanced industrialized country. But I think, this conversation about low-level, nonviolent, it does make a distinction, but I think it's really important. If we can't do that, we've got a really long way to go.
Great. Professor Elliott, could you talk a little bit about some of the changing obstacles to building wealth between today and maybe 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago? What are some of the ways that the contours have changed?
Well, I would argue that they haven't really changed all that much, in that one of the things that you need to build wealth is wealth. Assets beget assets, right? And so I think that the ongoing challenge for low-income families and minorities is that they weren't able to participate fully in things like the GI Bill, the Homestead Act, major periods in which we had wealth transfers. They didn't partake in those, right? And so they start off with less wealth, and we want to say that it doesn't matter. So that's why education ends up coming up short, because we want to say if we just give them a degree in and of itself, they'll be able to build wealth, right? And so if they apply themselves in school and do whatever else, they'll be able to build wealth. But it ignores the fact that if you start off with some wealth, your income goes farther. You can make different kinds of decisions, right? You can be our president has been bankrupt how many times? And on one side, that's a bad thing, but on the other side, he had those opportunities to take risks, to fail, right? A part of getting it right is failing. You have to fail a certain amount of times. And when you have no resources, even within your career trajectory, you tend to be very conservative and have to make certain kinds of decisions that don't necessarily bear forth the best fruit. So I don't think we have to think about this as some kind of like things have changed. But the problem is things have stayed the same. And what we need to do is think of some new ways of doing things. One more thing, I'll be quiet. I wanted to kind of piggyback on what they had already said. I kind of think about it differently. I think that too often in society we go to extremes. I'm all about revolution at the moment. So I really believe that in order for change to happen, it's not going to happen within the system. But it doesn't mean that I think government is all bad, that we need to get rid of government. No, we just need to imagine a better government. We need to demand of a government a better government. So I don't know that we don't need police, but by golly, we need better police. We need a better justice system. And we're almost constrained to be able to even imagine such a thing. Right? We have to once again be able to imagine the better selves that we have, right? The possibilities. In them, we have to demand it. I'll stop there, I can say.
Heading over to Professor Hamilton, you offered 10 bold solutions. I don't think, one of the many things I like about you is I don't think anyone will accuse you of being restricted by what may be politically plausible in the moment, but setting a bigger vision. But the question then, I think, is a reasonable one of how do we pay for these big and probably expensive ideas?
So it kind of depends on which of the expensive ideas we talk about. But the first thing about political plausibility, I doubt anybody could have said Donald Trump was political. Well, maybe people did say it, but and maybe they're especially in hindsight, we can see signs of how he could have been predicted. But the political question, I think that the American people, when they're presented with bold ideas in a coherent way, I think they can latch on to it. And there's some opinion polls that suggest that they do. For example, when presented with a federal job guarantee, a plurality of Americans support it as opposed to not support it. And of course, the critique is, well, you don't have a counterfactual. You don't say what they have to give up to get it. But nonetheless, there is at least some political support for these bold ideas. So, but the big question is, how do we pay for them? let's take baby bonds, for instance. Baby bonds would cost about $80 billion per annum. There are about 4 million babies born per year, and we estimate the average bond would be about $20. It's not a bond, by the way, it's an account set up at birth. And these would be federally managed accounts. So households can save all they want, but just like Social Security, this would be in something that the federal government would manage for the children, so that the children, again, are protected from whatever decision the parents make, good or bad. And the accounts would not all be the same. If you're born in the most wealth-poor family, you can get upwards to $50,000. And if, our stump speech, we say if you're Oprah Winfrey or Bill Gates' child, you might get a nominal account of about $500. Anyway, $80 to $90 billion is the cost. What we already spend on tax policy to enhance assets is in the tune of about $500 billion. And that would include tax savings and tax incentives for things like mortgage interest deduction, different ways in which we tax capital gains and dividends versus income, and not taxing capital gains at death. This amounts to over $500 billion, right? And it's all aimed at promoting assets, just like baby bonds. The problem is to whom they're distributed. The bottom 60% of households receive about 20% of that. If you're in the bottom 20% of households, you get on average about $4. If you're in the top 20%, you receive 70% of that. And I believe the top 5% gets about 60% of that. So what we're talking about is not cutting that budget, but taking at least a portion of it and redirecting it so that every American can have the opportunity for asset enhancement. And then, I won't belabor the issue of time, but there's certainly ways in which we can pay for a federal job guarantee. And the notion that the American government doesn't have the resources, we just passed a $1 trillion tax cut. And we're not, right, so the issue of concerns around the deficit, it wasn't a concern there. You saw that when we were at the height of the recession, the ability to come up with $13 trillion, and that's in a lower estimate to address the financial crises amongst banks. If you had a federal job guarantee, you'd have less of a need to bail out the banks because you wouldn't have to worry about Wall Street catching a cold and Main Street catching the flu, because there would be safety provisions for Main Street. So if Wall Street caught a cold, then just like capitalists, some survive, some don't. We wouldn't have to bail them out the next time around. So we have the capacity in the federal government, and I'm worried, in the interest of my colleagues, I'm not going to keep belaboring the point, but there's more I could say on it. It's just a matter of political will.
Last question to Professor Pettit. You've been a pioneer in, I think, capturing the importance of the invisible voices and the invisible stories that don't get told in our household surveys. Yeah. So for the group, how else would you recommend that we try to get the invisible voices represented in data, citizen participation, and policies? How do we bring to the table the voices of the homeless, the incarcerated, persons that are significantly impacted by racial inequalities?
It's a great question, whoever asked it, thank you. So one, I would like to implore my academic colleagues to acknowledge and respect work that is done of all different types, and community action research, ethnographic research. We have so much capacity and we know so much, and it's not always acknowledged, recognized, rewarded in the halls of academia. And so at some very basic level, I would like to implore my faculty colleagues, academic colleagues to do that, because I think it's out there. It's out there, and we're not always recognizing it with the importance that it deserves. So that's one, and I think the other someone brought up earlier, which is the empathy gap, and I think it's just so important for us to make sure that we do our very best to be as empathetic as possible. And I think about this a lot in my own work. I'm not incarcerated. I've never been incarcerated. But it's so important for me to bring the voices of people who have experience to the table. And I think as much as we can recognize all of the value that people can bring in the different methodologies, I think is essential.
All right, so I'm going to give my thanks for such incredibly thought-provoking presentations, for the inspiration that you've given us, and I'm going to turn it over to Hakeem. I think we should all celebrate with some lunch.